She walked out of that hospital, believing she finally had everything. She walked back in bleeding, childless, and destroyed by the one man she gave up everything to love. Charlotte Whitmore thought the hardest part of her life was behind her. At 27, she had the career, the marriage, the loyalty, and now finally the baby she had been waiting years for. But the moment she stepped outside that hospital, with an ultrasound photo pressed against her chest, her entire world detonated. The man she built from nothing was helping another woman. She was pregnant, glowing, and being cherished into a car that Charlotte paid for. The ultrasound photo was still warm from the printer. Charlotte held it against her chest as she pushed through the hospital's revolving door. She stepped out into the cold Chicago air. November had settled into the city the way it always did. It was not gradually, but all at once. It was like someone had flipped a switch and decided warmth was no longer permitted. Her breath came out in small white clouds. She barely noticed. She was already rehearsing what she would say to Adrian. She had run through the words a dozen times on the examination table. That was while the technician moved the probe across her belly. She had practiced the exact expression she wanted to see on his face when she told him. She was 8 weeks along. The doctor had said everything looked healthy. There was a strong heartbeat and good positioning. She had cried in the car on the way over, and she wasn't even ashamed of it. After 3 years of trying, they had endured 2 miscarriages. Neither she nor Adrian had spoken about them out loud to anyone. After a year of telling herself to stop expecting things she might never have, this felt like proof. It felt like something in the universe had finally decided she had suffered enough. She was still smiling when she spotted the black SUV. It was parked at the far end of the hospital's main drop-off lane. The engine was running. The hazard lights were blinking amber against the gray November sky. She recognized it immediately. It was a custom-built Chevrolet Suburban. The tinted windows were so dark they were technically illegal in Illinois. Adrian had 3 of them. His drivers kept them rotating. She had ridden in that exact vehicle hundreds of times. She knew the sound the door made when it closed. She knew the particular way the suspension sat when the vehicle was carrying weight. What stopped her wasn't the vehicle. It was the woman. She was blonde and heavily pregnant. She was moving carefully across the hospital's concrete sidewalk. Her long camel coat couldn't quite conceal the size of her belly. She walked with one hand pressed to the small of her back. The other hand was extended slightly for balance. She was a woman in her final weeks. She was someone who needed help and knew it. And Adrian was at her side. Charlotte stopped walking. She stood on the edge of the curb 5 car lengths away. She watched her husband take the woman's hand. He guided her toward the Suburban with a gentleness she recognized. It wasn't a performance. She had seen Adrian perform tenderness before at galas and family dinners. He did it for an audience that needed convincing. This wasn't that. This was the real thing. She saw the way he placed one hand at the small of the woman's back while opening the door with his other hand. She saw the way he ducked his head to check that she was fully seated before closing it. She noticed the way he lingered for 1 extra second with his hand on the doorframe. It was as though he was reluctant to put even a piece of metal between himself and her. Charlotte's lungs stopped working properly. The ultrasound photo crinkled in her fingers. She told herself there was an explanation. There were a dozen explanations. Adrian employed people. He helped people. The Morrow Syndicate ran operations that touched every corner of the city. Adrian had a habit of appearing in places he wasn't expected. The woman could be anyone. She could be an employee, a family connection, or someone's wife who needed a ride. She almost convinced herself. Then the SUV window rolled down. Adrian leaned in through the driver's side window. He said something that made the woman laugh. She really laughed, throwing her head back against the seat, and he smiled. It was not the smile Charlotte saw in press photographs or across boardroom tables. It wasn't even the smile she saw at their own dinner table anymore. It was the unguarded one. It was the one from years ago. It was from before the empire and before the power. It was from before the man he had become had swallowed the man she had fallen in love with. Charlotte's body moved before her mind gave permission. She was at her car in 30 seconds. Keys out, engine on. She pulled out of the parking structure one level behind the Suburban. She followed it north on Michigan Avenue, then west, then onto the highway. Her hands were steady on the wheel. That surprised her. Inside, she was shaking apart, but her hands were perfectly still. They were at 10 and 2. She followed the vehicle with 3 cars of distance between them. It was the way she imagined you were supposed to do it. She had never followed anyone in her life. She discovered she was apparently good at it. The Suburban exited the highway 40 minutes later. The neighborhood shifted. The density of the city thinned out and then disappeared entirely. It was replaced by long stretches of road flanked by bare limb trees. There were old money properties set far back from the street, behind stone walls and iron gates. She had been to this part of the city's outskirts only twice. Both times were as Adrienne's wife, invited to homes that cost more than some countries. She didn't know whose property this was. She found out when the Suburban slowed at a gate. The gate opened from the inside. Charlotte pulled her car onto the shoulder, 50 yards back. She cut the engine and sat there in the cold with the heat fading. She watched the Suburban pass through and disappear up a long gravel drive. It went toward a house that was more mansion than house. It had 3 stories and a limestone facade. It was lit from the outside by warm amber lights that made it look like something from a magazine spread about old Chicago wealth. She sat in the car for a long time. She was not a woman who fell apart easily. Charlotte Whitmore had grown up with money, but not softness. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, was old Chicago business. He was the kind of man who shook hands and ended careers at the same table. He considered emotional expression a character flaw. She had inherited his architecture, but not his coldness. She had learned early how to hold herself together in rooms that wanted to break her. She had stood beside Adrienne at events where half the attendees knew exactly what he was. She smiled through every second of it. But sitting in that car, watching the gate close, holding an ultrasound photo of a baby she had just found out existed. Something cracked. It didn't break. Not yet. It just cracked. She got out of the car. The cold hit her immediately. She hadn't brought a heavy coat. She had gone straight from the office to the clinic, expecting to be home by 6 o'clock. Her blazer was not built for November on the outskirts of Chicago. She walked along the stone wall that bordered the property. She looked until she found a section where the exterior floodlights didn't quite reach. There was an elm tree growing too close to the wall. It had pushed the stone up enough to give her footholds. She stared at that wall for a moment, then she climbed it. She dropped down on the other side into cold, wet grass. She crouched there for a moment, listening. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Wind moved through the elm trees lining the drive. She could see the house clearly from where she crouched. There were lights in multiple windows. The Suburban was parked in the circular drive near the front entrance. She moved along the tree line toward the house. She stopped at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet from the front steps, and she watched. Adrienne came back out the front door. He was alone. He had taken off his coat. In the amber light of the entryway, he stood at the top of the stone steps with his phone in his hand. He ran his other hand through his hair. It was a gesture Charlotte knew meant he was thinking. He was sorting something out and deciding something. He was still handsome at 41. He was built the way men built by adversity, rather than gyms are built. Broad through the shoulders, always slightly tired around the eyes. He was always slightly watchful in a way that never fully switched off, no matter where he was or who he was with. She had found that quality magnetic once. She watched him type something on his phone. He looked up. He looked out toward the gate. He looked back toward the house. He made a decision that she couldn't read. Then the front door opened again, and the woman appeared. She had changed out of the camel coat. She was wearing a cream-colored sweater now. Her blonde hair was loose around her shoulders. She moved carefully down the single step from the threshold to the landing. She kept one hand against the doorframe for balance. Adrienne turned when he heard the door. The distance between them closed without either of them visibly deciding to close it. One moment they were separate. The next, his arm was around her shoulders. Her head was turned up toward his, and he kissed her. It was not a performance. It was not something engineered for an audience. It had the ease of deep familiarity, It was the kind of kiss that doesn't need to announce itself because it already knows it belongs. The sound Charlotte made was quiet. It was not a sob and not a scream. It was something lower than both of those things. It was something that came from a place in her chest she hadn't known existed until that exact second. Her hand pressed flat against the bark of the elm tree she had been gripping. Her knees wanted to go, but she held them. She turned and walked back to the wall. She climbed it. She didn't remember climbing it. She was on the other side, and then she was at her car. Then she was driving, and she couldn't feel her hands on the wheel anymore. But they were still moving. They were still steering and keeping her alive on instinct. The rest of her sat somewhere outside her body, watching this happen to a woman she no longer recognized. She drove for 40 minutes before she stopped. She stopped at a gas station on the north side. She pulled into the lot, cut the engine, and sat with the ultrasound photo on the passenger seat beside her. The image showed a small, curved shape, barely distinguishable, floating in gray static. The strongest heartbeat the technician had ever heard, she had said. She had said it twice. Charlotte stared at the photo. Then she picked up her phone and called the only person she was not ashamed to fall apart in front of. Her college roommate, Diane Rowe, answered on the second ring. Diane said, "Charlie, it is almost 9 o'clock." Charlotte said, "I need you to find out who owns a property." Charlotte's voice was steady in a way that she knew frightened people who knew her. She said, "Estate on the north side off Sheridan, about 40 minutes out. Limestone, 3 stories, big iron gate." There was a pause. Diane asked, "What is going on?" "Can you find it?" Charlotte asked. "Can you find it or not?" She heard Diane's breathing shift. They had been friends for 9 years. Diane knew what that voice meant. She said, "Give me 20 minutes. It took her 12. The property was registered to a holding company called Hart Residential LLC. Diane found the principal name on the original purchase agreement in 4 more minutes. Vanessa Hart. Charlotte knew the name. She had met Vanessa Hart exactly twice. Once was at an office function 18 months ago. It was Adrienne's quarterly gathering for senior staff held at their home on the Gold Coast. Vanessa had been his executive assistant for 3 years at that point. She was in her early 30s and composed. She was the kind of professional who made you feel slightly underdressed, simply by being thorough. Charlotte had noticed her the way she noticed most of Adrienne's employees. They were background, competent but irrelevant to her life. The second time was 5 months ago. Charlotte had stopped by Adrienne's building unannounced to bring him a document he had forgotten. Vanessa had been at the elevator on his private floor, just stepping out, holding a garment bag. She had smiled and been professional. Charlotte had noticed nothing because she had not been looking for anything to notice. She sat in the gas station parking lot and thought about how many things she had not been looking for. The drive home to their Gold Coast townhouse took 20 minutes. She parked in the garage. She sat in the car in the dark for a while. She walked inside. The house was empty. Their housekeeper, Marguerite, had left at 7 o'clock as she always did on Thursdays. Charlotte moved through the kitchen and didn't turn on the lights. She sat at the kitchen island in the dark. Her phone was face down in front of her, and the ultrasound photo was beside it. She was still sitting there at midnight when she heard Adrienne's key in the door. She didn't move. He came in through the front. He heard nothing, checked the security panel out of habit, and saw her car was in the garage. He moved through the front hall and into the kitchen doorway. He reached for the light switch. The lights came on. He saw her. She watched his face do what faces do when they have been carrying something heavy for a long time and suddenly realized the weight has been noticed. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who had been rehearsing for a conversation he hadn't expected to have tonight. He said, "You are up late." Charlotte told him she went to the hospital today. Her voice was flat, not cold, just flat. It was emptied of inflection the way a room is emptied of furniture. She said, "I had a scheduled appointment, the one you forgot about last week." He hadn't moved from the doorway. He said, "Right, I meant to." She said, "I am pregnant, Adrienne." There was silence. She watched him absorb it. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes. The man whose entire life was built on reading rooms and making split-second decisions was suddenly very still in her kitchen doorway at midnight. And in that stillness, she saw something she had not wanted to see. He wasn't happy. He wasn't sad. He was calculating. He started to say, "That is." Charlotte cut him off. She said, "I followed you tonight." She slid the ultrasound photo across the marble countertop toward him. She told him it was from the hospital. She said, "You were there. Did you know I was there? We were in the same building. I was in prenatal. I walked out, and I saw you helping a woman into your car." He said nothing. Charlotte said, "I followed you to a property on Sheridan Road. It is registered to Vanessa Hart." She paused. She said, "The woman you were with was heavily pregnant." The kitchen was very quiet. Charlotte said, "So I need you to tell me something." Her eyes were dry. She had cried all the crying she was going to do in the car. She said, "I need you to tell me what is happening, and I need you to tell me right now. And I need you to tell me the truth because I am holding the picture of our baby. I am choosing to believe there is an explanation, and I am giving you exactly one chance to give it to me." Adrian Morrow was a crime boss. He was the feared underboss of the Morrow Syndicate. He was a man who had sat across tables from federal agents and walked out clean. He was a man who had ordered things done in dark rooms that Charlotte had never asked about, and he had never offered. He stood in his kitchen doorway in his very expensive suit. He looked at the ultrasound photo and said nothing. The silence told her everything she had not wanted to know. She stood up from the island. She said, "I want her name and the full story right now." He finally moved into the kitchen. He pulled out the stool on the far side of the island. He put the marble between them, a detail she noticed without seeming to, and sat down. He ran both hands over his face. He said, "It is complicated." Charlotte told him, "Do not tell me it is complicated. Do not tell me that." Her hands were flat on the island. She asked, "Is that Vanessa Hart? Is that your assistant?" There was a beat. He looked at the countertop and said, "Former assistant." "About 14 months ago." The number landed, 14 months. She traced backward through 14 months. She started cataloging things that had felt like nothing at the time. The late nights that happened more frequently. The trips that ran longer. The specific quality of his distraction that she had attributed to business. She had never questioned it because questioning Adrian was something she had learned not to do. Not out of fear, but out of a trained belief that she was supposed to trust him. She had believed she had earned that trust as a two-way thing. She asked, "Is she pregnant with your child?" His jaw tightened. She said his name, Adrian. He cleared his throat and said, "She says it is." Charlotte asked, "You don't know." He looked up. He said, "It is complicated, Charlotte, and I know you don't want to hear that word, but..." She interrupted him. "Is it yours or isn't it?" He said, "I don't know for certain." She breathed. She breathed carefully and deliberately. The way you breathe when the floor has dropped out from under you and you are locating the wall by feel. She asked, "How long have you been with her?" He said, "I told you, 14 months. Charlotte clarified, "Not the affair." "How long have you been taking care of her?" Something shifted in his expression. It was a specific kind of discomfort. He said, 6 months. She said, "You set her up in that house." He said nothing. She continued, "You have been paying for that house. That is why you restructured the Cayman account in May." She hadn't connected it at the time, but she was connecting it now, fast and cold. It was the specific misery of someone who has all the puzzle pieces and has been living inside the wrong picture. She said, "You have been running a second household." He didn't deny it. Charlotte picked up the ultrasound photo. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it very carefully back on the countertop. She left it face up so that the small curved shape of the heartbeat was visible to both of them. And she walked out of the kitchen. She went upstairs. She went into the bathroom. She locked the door and sat on the edge of the tub. She allowed herself 3 minutes of whatever it was that needed to come out. It wasn't crying exactly. It was something more structural. It was like something load-bearing had given way. After 3 minutes, she stood up. She washed her face with cold water and looked at herself in the mirror. She went to the guest room. She did not sleep. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she dressed, packed a single bag, and drove to Diana's apartment in Lincoln Park. She did not tell Adrian she was going. She did not leave a note. She sat at Diane's kitchen table, drank coffee, and told her everything. Diane had never liked Adrian and had never said so out loud. But she sat and listened, and said nothing except the right things at the right moments. Charlotte had not yet confronted Vanessa Hart. She made that decision at 9 o'clock in the morning. She drove back out to the Sheridan Road estate alone. It was a clear November morning, the light flat and cold. She rang the intercom at the gate. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then the gate opened. She drove up the gravel drive and parked behind the Suburban. It was still there from the night before. The front door opened before she reached it. Vanessa Hart was not what Charlotte expected, and also exactly what she had expected. Tall, early 30s, pretty in a composed and deliberate way. She was wearing a silk maternity robe and holding a cup of tea. Her expression when she saw Charlotte was not guilty. It was something worse. It was prepared. Vanessa said, "Mrs. Marrow." Charlotte said her own name to correct her. She didn't want Vanessa Hart using her married name. Charlotte said, "I would like to talk." Vanessa replied, "I thought you might." Vanessa stepped back from the door. They sat in a living room that had been furnished with money and intention. It was not the same taste as Charlotte's homes. It was different, softer, with warm colors and a particular domestic comfort that made Charlotte's stomach clench. This had been decorated for a life. It was someone's idea of what a life should look like. Charlotte asked, "How far along are you?" Vanessa said 36 weeks. Charlotte said, "And you are claiming it is his." Vanessa set down her tea. She looked at Charlotte with the patience of a woman who had been preparing for this. She said, "I am not claiming anything. It is his." Charlotte said, "He told me he wasn't sure." Vanessa replied, "Adrian says many things depending on who he is talking to." There it was, the flick of a blade between two words. It was not hostility. It was something more measured than that. It was a woman establishing the terms of a conversation on her own turf. Charlotte felt a grudging recognition of the technique. She would have used it herself. Charlotte asked, "How long have you been in love with him?" Vanessa's composure shifted slightly. It didn't break, just shifted. She said, "I don't think that is relevant." Charlotte said, "It is to me." There was a pause. Vanessa said, 3 years before the affair started." "Yes." Charlotte asked, "Did he pursue you or did you pursue him?" Charlotte pressed further, "I am asking a direct question. Did he come to you or did you make it happen?" Vanessa's chin went up slightly. She said, "It wasn't one-sided." Charlotte said, "That is not an answer." Vanessa finally said, "He came to me first." She said it without apology, but also without satisfaction. It was as though she was stating a fact she had spent a long time deciding what to do with. She said, "He came to me first, and I should have said no, and I didn't. And I am not going to tell you I regret all of it, because I don't." Charlotte held her eyes. She said, "You are carrying a child that may or may not belong to my husband. You are living in a house he is paying for, and you have spent the past 14 months helping him maintain a marriage he was never fully in, while you knew I was trying to have a baby." Something moved across Vanessa's face. Charlotte noticed it. She asked, "Did you know? Did you know I was trying?" The silence stretched. Charlotte said, "He told you." It wasn't a question. "He told you about the miscarriages." Vanessa looked at her tea. Charlotte's voice didn't waver. She wouldn't allow it. She said, "He told you and you stayed." Charlotte stood up. She said, "All right, we are done here. I want to know one thing before I go. Was there ever a moment, a single moment, where you thought about what you were doing to another woman? Not to me specifically, to any woman." Vanessa looked up. She said quietly, "I thought about it, and I kept going anyway." Charlotte nodded. She said, "At least one of you is honest." She was almost at the door when she heard the car in the drive. She knew the sound of his engine. She turned, and Vanessa was already standing. This meant Vanessa had known he was coming, which meant Vanessa had called him the moment Charlotte car appeared on the intercom camera. She had been expected. The conversation had been managed. Charlotte was still standing in the center of the living room when Adrian came through the front door. He took in the scene. His face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. The third one settled into something controlled and careful. He said, "Charlotte, I didn't know you were." She interrupted him. "You absolutely knew." "She called you the moment I rang the gate." He closed the door behind him. He looked at Vanessa. Some exchange happened between them that Charlotte felt in the room without being able to read it. Then he looked back at Charlotte. He said, "This wasn't how I wanted this to go." Charlotte asked, "How did you want it to go, Adrian? Walk me through the plan." She wasn't yelling, but she wanted to yell. The restraint was enormous, and she knew she was going to pay for it later. She asked, "Did you have a plan? Did you ever have a plan? Or were you just going to keep running two lives until one of them ended?" He told her she needed to lower her voice. Charlotte stopped and breathed. She said, "I am in her house. I came here to talk. I talked. I am leaving. And then you and I are going to have a completely different conversation tonight with lawyers." She told him, "Charlotte, I am pregnant." She looked at him with everything she had refused to feel in the kitchen the night before. She said, "I am carrying your child, and I find out today that you have a woman 36 weeks along, in a house you have been secretly running for 6 months. This was while I have been in fertility treatment and grief counseling in this marriage, believing it was a real marriage." Her voice cracked on the last word, just barely. She told him, "You don't get to tell me to lower my voice in this house." She moved toward the door. What happened next happened fast. She was never entirely sure afterward how the sequence went. Vanessa said something behind her. It was something directed at Adrian, not at Charlotte. Something short and sharp that Charlotte didn't fully process. Adrian moved toward Charlotte. She didn't know if it was to stop her, or to say something, or just to be between her and the door. They were close together in the narrow entryway hall. All three of them were in a space that was not built for confrontation. She pushed past him. His hand caught her arm. She pulled against it. She told him to let go of her. He said, "Just stop for a second." She told him to let go. She didn't see his hand move. She just felt the impact. It was the side of her face, then the wall at her back, and then the floor. She felt the cold hardwood against her cheek. She heard a sound she didn't recognize at first. It was too high and strange and continuous. Then she realized it was coming from her. She looked at the doorframe above her. She saw Adrian's shape in her blurred vision. He had one hand over his mouth. He was already backing away from what he had just done. It was as though the distance could revoke it. Vanessa was somewhere in the background, completely frozen. The pain in Charlotte's face was secondary to something else. It was something she felt lower and more central. It was a pressure that was wrong. It was a warmth where there should not have been warmth. She looked down. She pressed her hand to her abdomen. She said to no one in particular, "Call an ambulance." Her voice was very quiet and completely calm. It was the way a voice gets when the mind has absorbed more than it can process, and has defaulted to pure function. Nobody moved for a second. That lasted too long. She said, "Call an ambulance right now." She said it louder this time. She was still conscious when they arrived. She was barely conscious by the time they reached the hospital. She heard voices telling her to stay with them and telling her to keep her eyes open. She heard monitors. She felt hands. She felt the specific velocity of a gurney moving through a hospital corridor at maximum speed. The ceiling tiles were passing above her face in a blur. She thought about the ultrasound photo still on her kitchen counter. She thought, "I didn't bring it with me." She thought she should have brought it with her. Then everything went silent and very dark, and she stopped thinking anything at all. She woke in a recovery room. A doctor was there. She was a woman in her 50s, with the particular expression that doctors wear when they have only one thing left to tell you, and they have been waiting with it. Charlotte looked at the ceiling and then at the doctor. She said, "Tell me." The doctor told her. Charlotte closed her eyes. Outside in the hospital corridor sat a man she had not seen since college graduation. He sat in a plastic chair with his elbows on his knees. His hands were folded and his jaw was tight. He had been there for 4 hours. He had followed the ambulance. He had not left. His name was Nathaniel Blackwood, and Charlotte had no idea he was there. She had no idea that the man who had watched her world fall apart from a parking structure across the street from the hospital the previous evening was now here. He had been there by accident and stayed on purpose. He had been the one to call the ambulance when no one inside that house moved fast enough. She had no idea that this was not the last time his timing would be the difference between catastrophe and survival. She had no idea what was coming. The recovery room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air. And there was something beneath both of those things that Charlotte couldn't name, but recognized. It was the particular institutional smell of a place where bad news lived permanently. It was where it had soaked into the walls and the ceiling tiles, and the thin cotton of the blankets they put over you when your body had stopped doing what it was supposed to do. She had been awake for 40 minutes. The doctor had spoken. The nurse had spoken. Someone from the administrative side had come in with paperwork and left without making eye contact. This told Charlotte everything about how the hospital staff had processed the situation. She was a woman admitted by ambulance, no family present, no husband. A miscarriage at 8 weeks following physical trauma. Physical trauma. That was what the paperwork called it. Charlotte stared at the ceiling and let the phrase sit in her chest like a stone. The door opened and she expected another nurse. It was not a nurse. The man in the doorway was tall, maybe 6'2". He had the kind of build that came from discipline rather than vanity. He wore a dark suit, no tie, with the top button open. He had dark hair that needed cutting. He was holding 2 cups of vending machine coffee. He looked like a man who had been sitting in a hospital corridor for a very long time and had decided that was not enough and had done something about it. She knew his face. It took her 3 seconds to place it. The last time she had seen it in person was 9 years ago. The version in her memory was 22 years old and slightly sunburned from a graduation weekend spent mostly on the roof of a campus building, but the face was the same. It was older now and harder through the jaw. It had the specific stillness of someone who had learned to carry weight without showing it. She said his name, Nathaniel. His name came out like she had been holding it without knowing it. Nathaniel Blackwood crossed the room and set one of the paper cups on the tray beside her bed. He pulled the chair close and sat down and said nothing for a moment. He looked at her face. She watched him absorb the bruising along her cheekbone without reacting to it. It wasn't because it didn't register. She could tell from the quality of his stillness that it registered completely. He just decided that reacting would not be useful to her right now. She asked, "How long have you been here?" He said, "Since the ambulance." She looked at him and asked, "How did you know?" He said, "I was in the parking structure across from the hospital yesterday. I saw you come out. I saw what happened after." He picked up his coffee and said, "I followed the ambulance. I wasn't going to leave you here alone." She told him he could have come in. She said, "You didn't know I was in Chicago." He said it simply, not as an excuse. He said, "I didn't want the first thing you processed to be me." Charlotte looked at the paper cup on the tray. She wasn't ready to pick it up. She wasn't ready to do anything that constituted moving forward. She understood intellectually that time was going to continue passing whether she wanted it to or not. But her body was still several minutes behind her mind, and her mind was not in great shape. Nathaniel said, "They told you." It wasn't a question. She said yes. He didn't say he was sorry. She was grateful for that. She had already calculated how many times in the next weeks she was going to have to absorb someone else's sorrow about this thing that had happened to her. She thought about how many times she was going to have to manage other people's discomfort about her loss, while simultaneously trying to survive it herself. Nathaniel saying nothing was the first clean space she had been given since she walked out of that hospital 24 hours ago, believing her life was about to become what she had always wanted. She picked up the coffee. She said, "He hit me." The quality of the silence changed. Nathaniel said, "I know." She turned the paper cup in both hands. She said, "I have been trying to figure out if that matters, and I can't decide." He said, "It doesn't." She looked at him. He said, "I am not saying that to be simple about it." He continued, intended or not. "You are in a hospital bed and there is a bruise on your face, and the pregnancy is gone. The mechanics of how it happened don't change any part of what happened." She breathed in through her nose slowly. She said, "I know." He asked if she had somewhere to go. She said, "To Diane's place." He stood up. He didn't make a production of it. He said, "I will drive you when they discharge you if you want. If you would rather I call Diane, I will do that." He picked up his empty cup and said he was going to go find something with actual caffeine in it. He told her he would be outside. He was at the door when she said his name. He stopped. She asked, "Why are you in Chicago?" Something moved across his face that she would think about later. when she had more capacity for it. He said, "I will explain when you are out of this room." Then he was gone. She was discharged by noon. She did not see Adrian. She had his number blocked on her phone before the discharge paperwork was finished. She did not call her parents. She would deal with her parents later, when she could say what needed saying without her father turning it into a conversation about optics. She didn't want her mother crying and making it about something other than what it was. Diane knew, and that was enough for today. Nathaniel drove her to Lincoln Park in a black Audi. It smelled like leather and clean air. The seat was already adjusted for her before she got in, which she noticed, and then stopped herself from analyzing. He drove without talking. She kept her face toward the window and watched Chicago pass. They had spent 4 years at the same university in the same program. They were in the same year and the same overlapping circles. She had always known him as someone whose default mode was useful rather than decorative. He had been the person in study groups who showed up with the work already done. Then he helped everyone else finish theirs. She had always liked him with an easy and uncomplicated affection. It was the affection of someone who expects to keep seeing a person and therefore doesn't feel urgency about it. And then they had graduated and entered different stratospheres, and that had been that. He had spent the last 3 years in Europe. She knew from mutual connections that he was running an international division of Blackwood Global Holdings after his father's health declined. She had sent a card when the senior Blackwood passed 18 months ago. She wasn't sure if it had reached him. He pulled up in front of Diane's building and kept the engine running. He said, "I am in Chicago for the restructuring. I am taking over as CEO formally at the first of the year. I will be here." He looked at her and said, "I am not saying that as anything other than information. I am not going anywhere. And if you need anything, I am reachable." She said, "I know." She had her hand on the door handle. She said, "Thank you for not leaving me there." She went inside. Diane had cleared the guest room, changed the sheets, and left a stack of towels on the chair. She had also stocked the bathroom cabinet with things Charlotte might need. There was a handwritten note on the nightstand. It said only, "I am in the kitchen when you are ready. No rush. No questions until you want them." Charlotte read the note and sat on the edge of the bed. She understood she was going to cry again, and did it quickly and with as much efficiency as she could manage. Then she washed her face and went to the kitchen. They talked for 3 hours. At the end of it, Diane asked, "What do you need right now today?" "Just one thing." Charlotte thought about it. She said, "A lawyer." Diane said she knew 3. She said they were all the best one. They just specialized differently. Divorce and asset protection. Diane picked up her phone without another word. The lawyer's name was Margaret Tsai. She had the particular quality of a person who has heard every version of every terrible thing, and has decided that her job is not to be surprised, but to be precise. She met Charlotte at her office on Michigan Avenue the following morning. She listened to everything without interrupting. She took notes in small, precise handwriting that Charlotte noticed but couldn't read from across the desk. When Charlotte finished, Margaret Tsai set down her pen. She said, "You are aware of what your husband does for a living?" Charlotte said yes. Margaret said, "Then you understand that conventional divorce proceedings will have unconventional complications." She told Charlotte to tell her what she needed to know. Charlotte said, "The estate, our primary residence, is in both names. The offshore structures are in his alone." Margaret said that is actually useful for their purposes because it means they cannot be claimed jointly. She said Charlotte's personal assets, the ones she brought into the marriage, are protected by the prenuptial agreement. She paused and asked, "You did sign a prenuptial agreement?" Charlotte said yes. Margaret said she would need to review it and have it sent today. Margaret Tsai looked at her for a moment. She said she wanted to ask something that wasn't strictly legal. Charlotte nodded. Margaret asked, "Do you want him to know you have engaged me, or do you want to move quietly first?" Charlotte thought about the kitchen at midnight, the ultrasound photo on the counter, and the calculations she had seen move behind his eyes. She said quietly, for now. For 2 weeks, she moved through Diane's apartment like someone learning to occupy space again. She went to work. She was not going to stop going to work. That thought had lasted approximately 4 minutes, and she was good at her work, and she was going to keep being good at it, because that was one thing Adrian had not been able to take from her. He had never even tried to take it from her, which was a particular kind of mercy she had not appreciated until now. The agency she ran her division for had no connection to the Morrow Syndicate. It was hers. It had always been entirely hers. Adrian called twice. She didn't answer. He sent a message that said, "I need you to understand what happened. Please give me the chance to explain." She read it and put her phone face down. He sent a second one 4 days later. It read, "Charlotte, whatever you are doing, I need you to stop. There are complications you don't understand, and I cannot explain over text." She forwarded both messages to Margaret Tsai. On the 15th day, she came home to Diana's apartment and found Adrian in the lobby. He was not aggressive. He was not drunk. He was wearing the gray overcoat she had bought him 2 Christmases ago. He looked like a man who had not been sleeping well, which gave her a feeling she refused to identify. She told him, "You cannot be here." He said, "I just need 10 minutes. She said, "No." He said her name. She stopped walking toward the elevator and turned to look at him directly. The bruise on her cheek had faded to yellow by now. She watched him look at it. She said, "I am in contact with my attorney. If you want to communicate about the divorce, you communicate through yours. If you show up at my location again, I will call the police, and I will tell them exactly what happened at Vanessa Hart's house, and I will let the paperwork follow." His jaw tightened. He said, "If you do that, it opens doors neither of us wants opened." She replied, "Then don't make me do it." They looked at each other. There was a time, a long time, years of it, when his face had been her reference point for safety. It was when she could walk into any room he was in, and something in her chest would settle. She was looking at the same face and feeling nothing that resembled that. She was feeling tired, acutely and completely tired. He said, "Vanessa is not carrying my child." She heard the words. She let them land. She said, "Excuse me." He said, "It is complicated. There was a test. I had it done privately." He looked away. He said, "The child isn't mine." She stared at him. He continued, "I have been supporting her because she told me it was mine, and I believed her. I had already made commitments I didn't know how to walk back from, and by the time I understood what was happening." Charlotte held up her hand and told him to stop. She said, "I need you to hear this. What I am hearing is that you maintained a secret household for 6 months. You had an affair for over a year. You hit me in that woman's entryway, and I lost our baby. And now the story has changed." She asked, "And you want me to do what, Adrian? You want me to what? What is the version of this that ends well for you? What are you hoping I do right now?" His face did something complicated. He said, "I am not hoping for anything. I am telling you the truth." She said, "You should have tried that 14 months ago." She pressed the elevator button. She told him she meant it about the lawyers. She got in the elevator. She pressed the button for the 4th floor. She kept her face forward and her hands still. When the doors closed, she leaned against the back wall and breathed through her mouth until the floor arrived. She did not tell Diane what had happened in the lobby. She lay in the guest room with the lights off and thought about what he had said. She decided she had no infrastructure left for processing it tonight. She filed it somewhere and closed the drawer. She did not sleep well. At work the following week, someone new appeared on her professional calendar. Her director of accounts, Phil Garrett, stopped by her office door Wednesday morning. He was in his mid-50s and was the kind of man who communicated everything important with the volume of his not saying it. He told her they had a new enterprise contract coming through. Blackwood Global Holdings was restructuring their entire North American communications portfolio. They had specifically requested her division. Charlotte looked up from her desk. She said, "They asked for us by name." Phil said, "Ask for you by name, actually." Phil's expression was neutral in the way that professional expressions are neutral when they are being very careful. He added, "New CEO is hands-on. Apparently wants senior-level account management on the communications side." She understood immediately. She picked up her phone after Phil left and typed a message. "Did you do this?" Nathaniel's response came in 4 minutes. It said, "I needed the best division in the city." "Your name came up in the research." She stared at the screen. He sent a follow-up. "I am serious. You can say no. The contract stands either way because your team is genuinely the right fit, but I wanted to be transparent. She set the phone down. She picked it up again. She typed, "We will do a capabilities presentation Friday." She was not going to turn down a legitimate enterprise contract because of personal history. That was not how she operated, and she was not going to start now. Friday's presentation lasted 90 minutes. Nathaniel was professional in a way she respected. He was not performatively professional, not compensating for something, but genuinely engaged with the work. He asked specific questions that demonstrated he had read their materials thoroughly, rather than delegating that to someone else. He had 2 senior members of his team with him who were sharp and direct. She enjoyed the challenge of their questions. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Afterward, when his team had stepped out and they were alone for 30 seconds in the conference room, he said, "You are good at what you do." She replied, "I know." And then, because it was accurate, and she had decided to be accurate with him, she added, "Thank you for calling the ambulance." He looked at her and said, "You don't owe me anything for that." She said, "I know I don't. I am saying thank you anyway." He nodded, picked up his materials, and left. She stood at the window of the conference room and watched him walk across the open floor below. She thought about the difference between a person who needs something from you and a person who simply shows up. The divorce papers were filed the last week of November. Adrian was served on a Tuesday. By Thursday, Charlotte had heard from 3 different mutual connections that he was furious. It was not the cold-controlled anger that was his public register, but something raw. This meant it was real. She absorbed this information and took precautions. She changed the security codes on her office. She notified the building's front desk to require additional verification for any visitors to her floor. Diane called her paranoid. Charlotte said she preferred prepared. The following week, Nathaniel called. He said there was a function on Friday. It was an industry thing, black tie. He was expected to appear and make the rounds as the new name on the building. He paused, then said, "I have no interest in going alone." She thought about it. She said, "That is either a professional invitation or a personal one." He said, "I am aware of the ambiguity. I am leaving it there on purpose. You can decide which one to accept." She went to the function. It was the first public event she had attended since the hospital. She wore a dress she had bought before everything happened. It was black and structured. It was the kind of dress that communicated that the person inside it had not been defeated. She stood in a room full of Chicago's financial and social establishment. She talked about work and shook hands, and felt for the first time in weeks like herself. Nathaniel was good in a room. It was not in the way Adrian was good in a room. Adrian's social gift had always been a kind of controlled menace. It was a gravitational pull that people mistook for warmth. Nathaniel's was something different. He paid attention genuinely and specifically in a way that was rarer than people understood. He remembered names without being told twice. He connected people to each other with a lateral intelligence that moved conversation forward, rather than keeping it circling his own orbit. She watched him work the room and understood that she was watching a different species of powerful man. Near the end of the evening, he found her at the bar. He said, "You look like someone who has been thinking too hard." She replied, "I look like someone who is 2 glasses into a decent burgundy and reconsidering several life choices." He asked, "Which ones?" She said, "The one where I agreed to marry a man because I believed that loyalty was transferable." She set down her glass. She continued, "I helped him build everything he has. My family's money helped him finish school. My belief helped him believe in himself. And the whole time I was doing that, I was operating on the assumption that what you build together belongs to both of you." She paused. She said, "I was wrong about what I was building." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He asked, "What were you building?" She said, "His version of his life." She picked up her glass again. She added, "I was a character in his story. I thought it was our story." The car that picked them up was Nathaniel's. She had intended to take her own car home, but it was late, and she had the burgundy to consider. His driver was already there. They sat in the back seat in companionable silence for 10 minutes. He said, "I would like to see you again." He was not asking, he was stating it. He added, not at a function, not with an industry rationale. She looked out the window. The city at night was the same city it had always been. It was indifferent and brilliant and full of people doing things they would regret and things they wouldn't. She said, "I am not ready." He said, "I know." She added, "I don't know when I will be." He said, "I know that too." He looked ahead and said, "I am not in a hurry, Charlotte. I have been in a hurry my whole life and I am done with it." She thought about that as the car pulled up to Diane's building. She got out. She did not look back, and she did not make any promises. She went upstairs and lay in the dark. For the first time since everything broke, she felt something that was not grief. It was smaller than hope, thinner. It was a specific kind of tentative aliveness, like circulation returning to a limb that had been numb. She didn't trust it yet, but it was there. The call came 3 weeks into the new year. She was in her office at 7 o'clock in the morning. This was when she did her best work now, before the rest of the floor arrived, in the specific quiet of a building still coming online. Her coffee was on her desk, and she had 3 contracts open on her screen. She was doing fine. She was doing genuinely fine. Margaret Say's name appeared on her screen. She answered. Margaret said, "Adrian's attorneys have filed a counterclaim. They are contesting the asset structure, and they have raised the prenuptial's legitimacy." Charlotte set down her coffee. Margaret continued, "They are contesting the prenup. They are arguing that certain verbal agreements made during the marriage constitute an informal modification. It is not likely to hold, but it will slow things down and cost money to fight." She paused. Margaret said, "There is something else. They have submitted a filing that includes a claim that you were engaged in an affair prior to filing for divorce." The room was very quiet. Charlotte said, "That is a lie." Margaret said, "I know that, but they have submitted documentation and photographs." Margaret's voice was careful. She said, "They have photos of you and Nathaniel Blackwood at the industry function last November and at a subsequent lunch meeting in December." Charlotte closed her eyes. Margaret said her name, Charlie. Margaret never used her shortened name. Margaret said, "I need you to be completely honest with me about the nature of your current relationship with Mr. Blackwood." Charlotte said, "It is professional. His company is a client. He is someone I knew in college. Nothing has happened between us." Margaret said, "Then the documentation is incomplete and misleading, and we can fight it." There was a pause. Margaret said, "But I need to warn you. If Adrian Maros' legal team is willing to fabricate a counter-narrative, they are going to look for every angle. That means anyone close to you is a potential leverage point." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. She thought about Nathaniel walking into a hospital with vending machine coffee at midnight. She thought about a car already adjusted for her before she got in. She thought about a man who had told her he was not in a hurry and had apparently meant it. She thought about what it would cost him if Adrian turned his attention that direction. She said, "I need to make a call." She called Nathaniel. He answered on the first ring. She told him, "Adrian's lawyers are using photographs of us to build a counter-narrative. Professionally, we are fine, but if Adrian decides to escalate beyond legal channels..." Nathaniel's voice was even. He asked, "Are you telling me this so I will distance myself?" She didn't answer immediately. He said, "Because if that is what you are doing, the answer is no." She said, "Nathaniel, I am aware of who Adrian Morrow is. I have been aware since the night I sat in a parking structure and watched what his people did." He said, "I made a choice to stay in your proximity, and that choice stands. You don't get to make it for me." She was quiet. He asked, "What does your lawyer need?" Before she could answer, her second line lit up. It was an unknown number. She looked at it, and something moved in her chest. It was a premonition, cold and specific. She told Nathaniel to hold on. She switched lines. She said her name, Charlotte Whitmore. The voice was a woman's. It was composed and professional. It was a voice that delivered news as information rather than experience. The woman said, speaking, "This is Valerie Cross. I am the administrative coordinator for Blackwood Global Holdings. I am calling because we need to speak with you regarding a serious matter. It has come to our attention that confidential Blackwood Holdings client files were accessed from your agency's network 3 nights ago and were forwarded to an external address. We have documentation." She paused. The woman added, The forwarding IP address has been traced to your executive login. The floor dropped out. Charlotte's hand tightened on the phone. She said, "That is not possible." The woman replied, "Miss Whitmore, I understand this is." Charlotte cut her off. She said, "That is not possible. I have not accessed any Blackwood Holdings files outside of standard account management, and I have never forwarded anything externally." Her voice was steady, but her chest was not. She asked, "Who authorized this call?" Valerie said, "This was escalated through our legal team." Charlotte asked, "And who signed off on the decision to call me directly, rather than going through my agency's legal department? Give me a name." There was a pause. Valerie said, "I am not in a position to." Charlotte said, "Then I will wait until you are." She ended the call. She sat in her office in the early morning quiet with the phone in her hand. The city was still waking up outside her window. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this specific moment. The photographs, the counter-narrative, the prenup challenge, and now a corporate espionage accusation tied to her login credentials. She understood with complete clarity that these were not coincidences. Someone had spent time on this. Someone had built something. She switched back to Nathaniel. He was still there. She told him, "Someone accessed Blackwood Holdings files from my login 3 nights ago. I did not do it." There was a beat of silence that was different in quality from his usual silences. He said, "I know you didn't." Then quieter, he added, "Charlotte, I need you to go somewhere safe right now." Go somewhere safe was not a sentence Charlotte had ever expected to hear from a man in a business suit at 7 in the morning, especially while she sat in a glass-walled office on the 14th floor of a building she had worked in for 6 years. She heard it anyway. She said, "I am at the office." He said, "I know where you are. That is why I am saying, go somewhere else." His voice had changed register. The measured quality was still there, but underneath it, something had tightened. It was the way a structure tightens before it shifts. He said, "Don't use your work computer. Don't log into anything from the building network. Take your personal phone and go to Diane's or somewhere public and call me back from outside." She said, "Nathaniel, tell me what you know." There was a pause. It was not hesitation. It was calculation. He said, 3 nights ago, I was informed by my internal security team that there had been unusual access on the Holdings client files. Before they escalated it, I asked them to sit on it for 24 hours while I ran my own review." Another pause. He said, "Charlotte, the access came from inside my building, not from your agency. Someone used your login credentials from a terminal inside Blackwood Holdings headquarters." She was very still. She said, "Someone on your staff. Someone with access to your credentials and access to our internal systems." She said, "That is not a coincidence, and it is not a random breach. Someone built this." His voice was flat and certain. He said, "I have security pulling the internal camera footage from that floor right now. But I needed you out of your building before whoever made that call to you this morning decides the next step is showing up in person." Charlotte stood up from her desk. She picked up her personal phone and left her work phone on the desk. She took her coat from the back of her chair and walked to the elevator. She didn't stop at her assistant's desk. She didn't sign out, and she didn't do any of the things she would normally do when leaving mid-morning. She pressed the lobby button and watched the floor numbers descend. She kept her breathing deliberate. In the lobby, she pushed through the revolving door into the January air. She stood on the sidewalk and called Nathaniel back. She said, "I am outside." He told her his car was 2 blocks south, a gray Audi. He said his driver's name was Marcus and that he was already moving. She walked south with her coat open and the cold cutting through her blazer. She found the Audi idling at the corner. Marcus was in his 40s and broad-shouldered. He had the specific alertness of someone trained in more than driving. He got out and held the door without speaking. She got in. The car moved immediately. She was taken to Blackwood Holdings' private security office, which was not in the main building. It was in a separate address 3 blocks over. It was a floor in a nondescript professional building with no signage. The lobby desk was staffed by a man who did not ask her name because he already knew it. She was brought upstairs and put in a conference room with good coffee and no windows. She was told that Nathaniel was 10 minutes out. He arrived in 8. He came in with a man she didn't know, He was in his late 40s with close-cropped gray hair. He had the compressed energy of someone whose entire professional life had been spent in rooms where information was currency. He introduced himself as Roland Graves, head of security for Blackwood Holdings. He set a laptop on the conference table and turned it toward her without preamble. On the screen was a still image from an internal security camera. The timestamp read 3 days prior at 11:47 p.m. Location marker read, Floor 9, Client Records Access. The person at the terminal was a woman. She was tall with her dark hair pulled back, wearing a Blackwood Holdings employee badge on a lanyard. Charlotte leaned forward. The face was turned away from the camera, but the angle was enough. The posture was enough. It was the specific way the woman held her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. It was a habitual asymmetry that Charlotte had noticed across a conference table not 3 months ago. Charlotte said, "That is Victoria Blackwood." The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Nathaniel did not react visibly. Roland Graves did not react at all. Charlotte said, "She has an internal badge. She still has building access." Roland said her access was supposed to be restricted to floors 1 through 3 following the restructuring. He said Floor 9 requires an additional keycard authorization that she should not have had. He paused. He added, "We believe the secondary authorization was obtained through a staff member who has since been placed on administrative leave." Charlotte sat back in her chair. She looked at Nathaniel. He was standing with his arms crossed and his jaw set. He was looking at the frozen image on the screen with the expression of a man absorbing a confirmation he had been hoping not to receive. Charlotte asked, "How long?" He looked at her and asked, "How long what?" She said, "How long have you suspected it was her?" There was a beat. He said, "Since the photographs appeared in Adrienne's legal filing." She felt the shape of it forming. She said, "The photographs of us at the function. Those weren't Adrienne's people." Nathaniel said no. Charlotte said Victoria gave them to his legal team. Nathaniel replied, "That is what I believe, yes." Charlotte breathed slowly through her nose and looked at the conference table. She assembled the architecture of the past 2 months, the counter-narrative in the divorce filing, the accusations of an affair, the photographs taken at a public event but framed as evidence of something clandestine, and now a corporate espionage setup, her login credentials used from inside a building she didn't work in. A phone call designed to preempt any investigation by putting her on the defensive first. She said she has been coordinating with Adrienne. Nathaniel said no. His voice was definite. He said, "That is the part that took me time to understand. Victoria doesn't care about Adrienne. She doesn't know him, and he doesn't know her. She is doing this independently." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He explained, "Victoria has been under the belief for several years that she and I would eventually marry. It was never something I said. It was something she constructed, and I failed to dismantle clearly enough, early enough, and that failure is mine tightened." He said, "When she realized I was spending time with you, she decided you were the obstacle." Charlotte looked at him. She said, "I am the obstacle to what she believes she is owed." She asked, "How long has she been building this?" Roland Graves answered. He said, "Based on what we have reconstructed, she began gathering information approximately 6 weeks after the industry function. She made contact with someone in your agency's IT infrastructure. We don't yet know who, to obtain your credentials. She obtained the Blackwood internal access separately. The timing was deliberate. She waited until the divorce proceedings were at a point where additional evidence of misconduct would cause maximum damage." Charlotte pressed both palms flat on the table. She thought about Margaret Say's voice on the phone. Anyone close to you is a potential leverage point. She thought about how thoroughly she had misread the geography of her own situation. She had been watching Adrienne. She had been watching the divorce proceedings. She had been watching the road in front of her. Someone had been moving through the dark on her left flank the entire time. She asked, "What does she want?" End state. What is she actually trying to accomplish? Nathaniel said, "She wants you gone." It came out without softness, because he was not a man who dressed up true things in comfortable language. He said, "Gone from my professional life. Gone from my personal proximity. Gone from Chicago if possible. She doesn't care how it happens. A destroyed reputation would accomplish it. A criminal charge for corporate espionage would be better. He paused. He added, she has resources. Her adoption into the Blackwood family gave her a trust structure that operates independently of my oversight. Charlotte asked, does she know you found this footage? He said, not yet. Charlotte looked at Roland Graves. She asked, what happens when she finds out? The security chief's expression was the expression of a man who had already run the scenario. He said, she escalates. People who build these kinds of campaigns don't stop when the primary play fails. They have contingencies. Charlotte pushed back from the table and stood up. She walked to the far end of the conference room. There were no windows, but there was a blank wall. She stood facing it with her back to both men. She thought about the fact that she had walked out of a hospital 8 weeks ago with nothing, and had spent every day since rebuilding in very small increments. She had been laying one plank at a time, and the floor was currently being pulled out from under her in 3 directions simultaneously. Adrienne's legal team was attacking the divorce proceedings. A corporate espionage accusation was attached to her professional identity, which was the one thing she had kept clean through all of this. And now, a woman she had met twice in a conference room had apparently decided to burn Charlotte's life down as a prerequisite to her own happiness. She turned around. She said, I need to talk to Victoria. Both men looked at her. Nathaniel started to say her name. She said, not to confront her. Not yet. She came back to the table. She said, I need to understand what she actually has. The footage proves she accessed the files. It does not tell us what she did with them, who else she has been talking to, or what other materials she has been building. If we move on her now with what we have, she burns whatever she is holding, and we are left managing secondary damage we cannot see yet. She looked at Roland Graves. She asked, has she been in contact with anyone in the media? He checked something on his laptop. He said, we flagged 2 email exchanges with a business journalist at the Tribune. Nothing published. The conversations appear to be preliminary. Charlotte said she is holding it because she hasn't fired it yet, which means she is waiting for something. She paused. She continued, she is waiting to see if the corporate espionage angle holds. If your legal team presses charges based on Valerie Cross's call this morning, the Tribune story runs, and the divorce counter-narrative lands at the same time, and I am finished professionally before any of it gets corrected. She looked at Nathaniel. She said, she is not stupid. He said, no, she is not. Charlotte said, then I need access to her before she knows the footage exists. I need to sit in a room with her, and I need to understand the full scope of what she has built. She held his eyes. She asked, can you get me that? He was quiet for a moment. He said, she will know something is wrong the moment I call her. Charlotte said, then don't call her. Invite her to something she would want to attend. Charlotte picked up her coffee cup. She said, you are the new CEO. There are events. There are family obligations. There are a dozen reasons you might invite her somewhere without it reading as unusual. She set the cup down. She said, I need 48 hours. Roland Graves looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel looked at Charlotte with the specific quality of attention he had when he was deciding whether to trust something or someone. It was not because he was suspicious, but because he was careful with trust and always had been. He said, 48 hours. The event was a small private dinner at the Blackwood family residence on the North Shore. It was a property Nathaniel had inherited along with the company. It was a sprawling lakefront house that his mother still treated as the family's primary social venue. He called his mother that afternoon and asked her to host a family dinner Friday evening. His mother, Eleanor Blackwood, was 71 and sharp. She had been trying to get Nathaniel to attend more family functions since his return from Europe. She agreed with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening. Victoria was invited as a matter of course. She was family. She had always been included. Charlotte was not told the details of the dinner arrangement. She was told only that she would have access to Victoria in a semi-private setting on Friday evening, and that Roland Graves would have 2 members of his team on site. She spent the 48 hours in preparation. She worked with Margaret Tsai to document her whereabouts and device activity for the night of the file access. She worked with her own agency's IT department to establish a forensic record of her login credentials' integrity. She was methodical and thorough, and she did not tell anyone except Diane what was actually happening. And Diane, who had law school in her background before pivoting to architecture, sat with her 2 evenings in a row and helped her think through angles. Thursday night, Charlotte could not sleep. She lay in the dark at Diane's apartment and stared at the ceiling. She ran the conversation she was planning to have with a woman she barely knew. She ran every version of it. She was not afraid of confrontation. She had sat across from Adrian in a kitchen at midnight with her whole life coming apart and had stayed level. She had listened to Vanessa Hart tell her she had kept going anyway and had found a way to walk out of the room. She had endured things that would have fractured women with less structural integrity, and she was still standing. But this was different. This was someone she had never wronged, whose grievance against her was purely territorial. Her campaign against her was not personal, in the way betrayal is personal, but purely strategic. It was the removal of an obstacle. There was something almost more frightening about that. It was hatred rooted in injury. She understood she could work with injury. She didn't know what to do with someone who looked at her and saw nothing but a problem to solve. Friday evening, she dressed carefully. It was nothing that read as confrontational. She wore a charcoal wrap dress and low heels with her hair down. It was the visual language of someone who had been invited to dinner and expected dinner. Marcus drove her to the North Shore. She was brought in through a side entrance by Roland Graves, who walked her through the ground floor layout in 4 efficient sentences. He told her Victoria had arrived 20 minutes earlier and was currently in the front sitting room with Eleanor. Charlotte went to the front sitting room. Eleanor Blackwood was exactly what the name suggested. Old money, old bearing. She was the kind of woman who had been the most competent person in every room she had ever entered and had spent 71 years deciding whether or not to let people know it. She looked at Charlotte when she entered with evaluating attention. It was a rapid assessment that she had the grace to make feel like warmth. She said, "Miss Whitmore, Nathaniel speaks very highly of you." Charlotte said, "He has been generous." Victoria was on the far side of the room. She was perhaps 34 or 35, with the particular groomed attractiveness of someone who had always understood that appearance was a form of armor. She had dark hair and good clothes. The expression she wore when Charlotte walked in lasted less than a second, before it was replaced with something smooth and composed and socially appropriate. But Charlotte saw it. It was that fraction of a second. Surprise recalculated into control in real time. Charlotte said, "Victoria, I don't think we have been properly introduced. I am Charlotte Whitmore. I am working with Nathaniel on the Blackwood Holdings Communications restructuring." Victoria said, "I know who you are." And there it was, the slippage, the tiniest departure from the composed surface. The 3 words were delivered with a precision that was too precise, too aware, and too loaded for a woman who was supposed to be meeting a professional contact for the first time. Eleanor looked between them with the sharp attention of a woman who had been reading rooms for 7 decades. The dinner proceeded. Charlotte was patient. She had always been patient in ways that people mistook for passivity, which was one of the more useful misreadings she had ever allowed to persist. She ate. She conversed. She responded to Eleanor's questions about the communications, work with enough specificity to be credible and enough warmth to be likable. And she watched Victoria across the table manage the dinner with the performance of someone who had not expected this variable and was recalculating steadily. After dinner, Eleanor excused herself at Nathaniel's quiet signal. Something had been arranged. Charlotte realized it was some cover for Eleanor to withdraw. Charlotte and Victoria were left at the table with their wine glasses and the remains of dinner between them. They sat in the particular silence of 2 people who know a conversation is coming. Charlotte set down her fork. She said, "I know what you did." Victoria's hand was still on her wine glass. She did not move it. She said, "I don't know what you're." Charlotte cut her off. She said, "Floor 9, Blackwood Holdings headquarters, 3 nights ago, 11:47 p.m. Charlotte watched Victoria's face. She said, The camera coverage on that floor is more thorough than you knew. Roland Graves has had the footage since Wednesday morning. The color in Victoria's face did not drain. She was too controlled for that. But something shifted behind her eyes. It was a rapid interior adjustment. It was the way a chess player looks when a piece they thought was safe has suddenly been threatened. Victoria said, "That is a serious accusation." Charlotte kept her voice even. She said, "It is not an accusation. It is a description of documented footage. I am not interested in the legal component tonight. I will leave that to Roland. What I am interested in is understanding the full scope of what you have built, because I need to know what is still in play before I decide how to respond to the rest of it." Victoria set down her wine glass. She asked, "You think you understand what this is?" Her voice had changed. The social register was gone, replaced by something more direct. Charlotte recognized with a distant clinical interest that she was now talking to the real woman. Victoria said, "You walked into Nathaniel's life, and you looked at everything I have spent years being close to, and you treated it like furniture, like a backdrop for your recovery." Charlotte said, "I wasn't aware we were in competition." Victoria replied, "That is exactly the problem." There was a flatness in Victoria's voice now, a specific chill. She said, "You have never been aware of me at all. You looked right through me every time. That is not something I am going to accept." Charlotte said, "So, you decided to end my career instead." Victoria said, "I decided to remove you." She said it with a simplicity that was more alarming than rage would have been. She said, "You don't belong in his life. You are a damaged woman using him as a landing pad while you process a divorce. And he is too." She stopped. Charlotte asked, "To what?" Victoria said, "Too attached to see it clearly." Charlotte looked at her for a long moment. She asked, "What else do you have beyond the file breach and the photographs? What are you still holding?" Victoria smiled. It was the smile of a woman who believed she still had a card in her hand. She said, "More than you want me to have." Charlotte told her to tell her what it was. Victoria asked, "Why would I do that?" Charlotte said, "Because if you tell me now, we control the scope of what happens next. If I have to find out through Roland's investigation, the scope expands in directions that are going to be significantly worse for you." She paused. She added, "I am giving you one chance to de-escalate this. That is not weakness. That is me offering you an exit from a situation you built and cannot finish." Victoria looked at her with the cold, precise attention of someone running probability. Charlotte said, "The journalist at the Tribune." "What did you give her?" Something moved across Victoria's face. Charlotte said, "You gave her something beyond the photographs. Something about the divorce proceedings. Something about the Morrow Syndicate." She watched Victoria's expression. She said, "You gave her Adrian." The silence confirmed it before Victoria said a word. Charlotte felt the floor shift under her feet in a way that was different from every previous shift, because this one had a different architecture. This wasn't about her divorce or her credentials or her relationship with Nathaniel. This was about Adrian Morrow and the Morrow Syndicate. It was about a journalist at a major Chicago newspaper who had been fed information by a woman with a personal vendetta, a trust fund, and no particular concern for the collateral consequences. Charlotte asked, "What did you give her?" Victoria's composure had returned. She said, "Enough." Charlotte asked, "Enough to what?" Victoria said, "Enough to burn everything down, including you, including him, including anyone who gets in the way." She picked up her wine glass again, composed and deliberate. She said, "You wanted the full scope. That is the full scope." "I don't do half measures, Charlotte. I never have." Her eyes were steady, she said, "and that story runs Monday morning unless." The word hung in the air of Eleanor Blackwood's dining room like smoke. Charlotte did not move. Victoria had left the sentence open on purpose. It was the oldest negotiating technique in existence. It was the incomplete threat. The door left ajar to let the other person's imagination finish the work. Charlotte recognized it and refused to walk through it. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face still and waited. She asked, "Unless what?" Victoria turned her wine glass slowly by the stem. She turned the glass one rotation, then two. She said, "Unless you leave Chicago. Leave the account, leave Nathaniel." She set the glass down. All of it clean. No drama. You were never here. Charlotte looked at her. She thought about the 8 weeks she had spent rebuilding from a hospital bed. She thought about the morning she had gone to work, when going to work was the only form of survival available to her. She thought about what it had cost her to sit across from Nathaniel Blackwood and accept coffee from a vending machine. To allow someone to be kind to her without flinching away from it, because kindness had become a thing she no longer trusted. She said no. Victoria's expression did not change. She said, "Then Monday." Charlotte stood up. She said, "You are not going to run that story. Not because I am asking you not to, because by Monday morning, Roland Graves will have filed a formal report with the building's legal team, documenting the Floor 9 breach, your credentials, and your timeline. And that report will be in the hands of the Tribune's editor-in-chief before your journalist friend can file a single word. And whatever you gave her about Adrian Morrow will be contextualized as information obtained through corporate espionage by a source facing criminal exposure." She held Victoria's eyes. She said, "You built something fragile and dressed it up to look solid. I have seen the foundation. It doesn't hold." She walked out of the dining room. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the hallway, not from fear, but from the specific physiological cost of sitting very still while your entire nervous system is screaming. She pressed one hand flat against the hallway wall and breathed once, twice, 3 times. And then Roland Graves was at her elbow, and Nathaniel was coming down the hallway from the direction of his mother's study. She had approximately 4 seconds before she needed to be functional again. She used them. When Nathaniel reached her, Charlotte said, "She gave the journalist something about the syndicate. I don't know what specifically. She said enough to burn everything down." That is her language. She looked at Roland. She said, "I need to know what she actually has before Monday." Roland already had his phone out. He said he would have someone on the journalist tonight. Nathaniel said, carefully. "Always," Roland replied, and moved down the hallway. Nathaniel looked at Charlotte. Something in the quality of his attention had shifted. Not the steadiness that was constant, but there was something underneath it now. There was a tightness around the jaw that told her the calculation behind his eyes had reached a conclusion he didn't fully like. She asked, "What aren't you telling me?" He said, "Nothing you need to." She said his name, Nathaniel. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Victoria has been in contact with someone connected to the Morrow Syndicate for approximately 3 weeks. We picked it up through a secondary flag in Roland's monitoring. I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain of the connection, and I didn't want to add to what you were already carrying." The hallway was very quiet. Charlotte said, "She has been talking to someone in Adrienne's organization. A peripheral connection, not Adrienne directly. Someone who had reason to want additional leverage in the divorce proceedings." He paused. He said, "I believe the syndicate contact gave her the material about Adrienne's operations that she passed to the journalist, in exchange for the photographs and the corporate espionage setup, which benefited both of them." Charlotte closed her eyes. She opened them. She said, "So Victoria and a faction of the Morrow Syndicate have been running parallel operations against me, coordinating through an intermediary, neither of them fully aware of what the other is doing or how far the other is willing to go." He said, "That is what I believe." She continued, "And now Victoria has told a Tribune journalist enough about syndicate operations to potentially trigger a federal investigation, which means the syndicate contact she has been working with is going to find out what she has done, and they are not going to be pleased." She watched Nathaniel's face confirm it without words. She asked, "Where does that leave me?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "It leaves you in the middle of something that has gotten significantly larger than a divorce and a corporate dispute. That is why I am telling you now, because the next 24 hours are going to move fast, and I need you to understand the full geography." She was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up her coat from the hallway chair and said, "Call Marcus. We need to move tonight." The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. Charlotte spent most of it on the phone with Margaret Sy, who listened to everything with the focused silence of a woman recalibrating her entire strategic map in real time. When Charlotte finished, Margaret said, "If the journalist has syndicate operational detail, the moment that story breaks, The divorce proceedings become secondary. Federal investigators will freeze everything connected to Morrow pending inquiry. That includes jointly held assets. Charlotte said, I know. Margaret added, it also means Adrian will know the story is coming. He will move to contain it. The way he contains things is not always legal. Charlotte said, I know that too. Margaret's voice shifted into its most careful register. She said, if there is a syndicate faction involved in building this case against you, and if Victoria Blackwood has now compromised their arrangement with the journalist's contact, you may be in a position where multiple parties with significant resources and no legal constraints are managing a crisis in which you are a central variable. She paused. She said, I need you to consider your physical safety. She had not considered it. She considered it now, sitting in the back seat of a black Audi moving through Chicago at 11 at night. She felt the cold, specific weight of understanding that she had been thinking about this as a legal and professional problem for so long that she had not fully accounted for the fact that one of the parties involved was a crime organization. She called Diane. She said, I need you to go to your sister's tonight. Diane asked, what? Charlotte said, Charlie, just for a few days. Don't argue. Go tonight after I call you back. She hung up. She called Nathaniel. She asked, where are we going? He said, somewhere that isn't your apartment and isn't mine. He was in a separate car. He had taken his own vehicle from the North Shore while Charlotte took Marcus. He said, I have a property in River North that isn't registered to me directly. It was acquired through a holding structure for exactly the kind of situation where I need somewhere that cannot be found quickly. He paused. He said, I want you there tonight and tomorrow. Tomorrow we find out what Victoria gave the journalist, and then we decide what to do about it. The River North property was a floor of a converted warehouse building. It had industrial bones and a clean interior. It was the kind of space that communicated money without announcing it. Roland Graves was already there when they arrived. Two men Charlotte didn't recognize were posted at the building's entrance in the stairwell door. She noted them and said nothing. Inside, Roland had set up a working station on the dining table. There were 2 laptops, printed documents, a board on the wall with photographs, and a timeline. He had built it with the efficiency of someone who had spent the last 3 hours in motion. Charlotte stood at the board and read it. Victoria Blackwood, the journalist, whose name was Dana Reyes from the Tribune business desk, 7 years on the paper. A name she didn't recognize. Syndicate Peripheral. Roland had written with a question mark connected to Victoria by a dotted line. Adrian's name in a separate column was connected by another dotted line to the peripheral contact. Her own name was at the center of it all, connected to everything and originating nothing. It was the still point around which everyone else had been moving. She asked, what is the material? What did Victoria actually give Reyes? Roland pulled up a document on one of the laptops. He said, based on what our contact was able to establish tonight, the material includes financial routing documentation for 3 Morrow Syndicate offshore structures, account numbers, transfer histories, and names of 2 shell companies used for moving money through a legitimate hospitality business. He paused. He added, if accurate, it establishes a direct link between the syndicate's illegal revenue and a federally regulated financial institution. Nathaniel spoke from across the room. He said, bank fraud at minimum. Roland looked at Charlotte. He said, the question is how Victoria obtained that documentation. She doesn't have direct access to Morrow Syndicate operations. Charlotte said, the peripheral contact gave it to her, which means someone inside the syndicate's financial structure is willing to burn Adrian to apply pressure in the divorce proceedings. She thought about it. She said, someone who benefits if Adrian is weakened, someone who has been waiting for an opportunity. Nathaniel said, an internal faction. Adrian has enemies inside his own organization. She had always known this. She knew it the way she knew certain things about his world. As background noise she had trained herself not to hear. She said, someone decided my divorce was the opening. She turned away from the board. She asked, does Adrian know? Roland looked at his phone and said, unknown. She made a decision then, fast and cold. It was the way the best decisions get made without ceremony. She picked up her personal phone and called Adrian. Nathaniel looked at her sharply. She held up one hand and kept her eyes on the middle distance and listened to the line ring. One ring, two. He answered on the third, which meant he had seen her name and decided to pick up, which meant he was either expecting her call or had been waiting for it. He said her name. His voice was controlled but not relaxed. It was the voice of a man who had been awake for a while. She said, "There is a Tribune journalist named Dana Reyes. She has financial documentation connected to 3 of your offshore structures, account numbers, and transfer histories. She is planning to run it Monday." Silence. Charlotte continued, "Someone in your organization gave it to her, through a third party connected to the divorce proceedings. You have a faction problem, Adrian, and it has been running for at least 3 weeks. More silence. Longer this time. He asked, "Why are you telling me this?" It was not a question exactly. It was a man trying to understand the geometry of something that wasn't adding up. She said, "Because if that story runs Monday, the federal exposure doesn't just hit you. It freezes every asset connected to our joint holdings and delays my divorce proceedings by 18 months while investigators go through everything. I want my divorce finalized. I want my life back, and I cannot have either of those things if you are in the middle of a federal investigation." She paused. She said, "So, I am telling you because our interests for approximately the next 72 hours are aligned." There was a long pause. He asked, "Who is the third party?" She said, "A woman named Victoria Blackwood, Nathaniel Blackwood's adopted sister. She has her own reasons, and they have nothing to do with you. She was used." Charlotte looked at Roland, who was watching her with professional assessment. She continued, "She may not fully understand what she was given or what it would trigger. She thought she was lighting a fire under me. She didn't know how much accelerant was on the ground. She heard Adrian breathe, one slow exhale. It was the specific sound of a man reorganizing his threat matrix. He said, 'I need a name, the person in my organization.' She said, 'I don't have one. Roland Graves has a partial. I will send you what we have.' He repeated the name, Roland Graves, Blackwood's security man. She said, 'Yes.' Another pause. He said, 'This is a strange conversation, Charlotte.' She replied, 'I know.' He said, 'You are working with him.' She said, 'I am working with his security division to address a corporate breach that was built to destroy my career.' 'Yes.' She kept her voice even. She asked, 'Are we going to discuss the nature of my professional associations? Or are we going to address the fact that you have a faction leak, and 72 hours before it goes public?' She heard him move. She heard the sound of a door closing. He was finding privacy. He said, 'I will handle my side. I need something from you in exchange.' The silence was shorter this time. She asked, 'What?' He said, 'The counter-narrative in the divorce filing, the affair accusation. I need it withdrawn by Monday morning, before the Tribune situation develops. If my name is attached to misconduct allegations, when that story breaks, the connection will be assumed regardless of accuracy.' She paused. She said, 'I am giving you information that is worth significantly more than a withdrawn legal filing. You know that.' She heard him think. He said, 'Done.' The line went dead. She set the phone on the table. Nathaniel was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. It wasn't disapproval, not surprise exactly. It was something more complex than either. He said, 'You warned him.' She replied, 'I used him. There is a difference.' The night moved fast after that. Roland's team worked through until 4 in the morning, establishing the chain of documentation from Victoria to Dana Reyes. They identified the syndicate peripheral contact. It was a man named Cass Merrill. He was a mid-level financial coordinator for a Morrow-adjacent hospitality group. He was someone with access to the routing documentation and a history of quiet resentment toward the syndicate's leadership structure. He was someone who had apparently decided that destabilizing Adrian through the divorce proceedings was a manageable risk. He had miscalculated. At 6 in the morning, Charlotte's phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Tsai. It read, "Counter-narrative filing withdrawn as of midnight." Morrow's attorneys filed the notice with the court. "We are clear on the divorce record." She showed it to Nathaniel without comment. He read it and handed the phone back. He asked, "What does it cost you?" Calling him, warning him. She thought about it honestly. She said, "Nothing I hadn't already paid." She looked at the table. She said, He is going to spend the next 72 hours looking inward at his own organization. That means he is not looking at me. And whatever he finds, it will keep him occupied well past the point where he could cause me further damage in the proceedings. She paused. She said, "It is not forgiveness. It is geometry." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. He said, "You have gotten better at this," she replied. "I have had a difficult few months." At 8 Saturday morning, Roland's contact at the Tribune reached Dana Reyes before she filed anything. The contact informed the journalist that her primary source for the financial documentation was facing corporate espionage charges, and that the documentation's provenance was legally compromised. The story was pulled pending editorial review. Charlotte heard this and felt something in her chest loosen incrementally. She had been awake for 26 hours. She was sitting on the couch in the River North warehouse with her shoes off. Her second cup of coffee was going cold on the table when Nathaniel came and sat at the other end of the couch. He said, "You should sleep in a minute," she replied. "That minute has been coming for about 4 hours." She looked at him in the gray morning light coming through the warehouse's high windows. He looked tired in a way he hadn't allowed himself to look the night before. The controlled alertness had finally settled into something more human. His jaw was less set, and his shoulders were carrying their actual weight rather than the performance of carrying none. She said, "Victoria is not done." He replied, "No. Even with the footage, even with the filing, she is not the kind of person who stops." He said, "I know." He looked at the window. He added, "I have known that for a long time, and I handled it badly." She asked what that meant. He said, "It means I knew what she believed about us, and I let it persist because addressing it directly was a conversation I didn't want to have. That is cowardice dressed up as consideration, and I am not going to pretend otherwise." He looked at her. He said, "Whatever she does next is partly the result of something I failed to prevent." Charlotte looked at him steadily. She said, "She is not your responsibility." He said, "No, but the conditions I created are." He paused. He said, "I don't do guilt well. I do better with action. So, I am going to address Victoria directly this weekend, and I am going to be completely clear in a way I should have been a long time ago. And I am going to do it with Roland in the building because I no longer trust what she might do." Charlotte nodded slowly. She thought about the board on the wall, the timeline, and all the lines connecting all the names. She thought about the fact that 24 hours ago, she had been sitting across a dinner table from a woman who had spent months building a machine designed to end her. She had sat through 2 courses of it before dismantling it to its component parts. And that had cost her something she was only now beginning to calculate. She was tired. It wasn't the sleep deprivation kind of tired. It was deeper than that. It was the kind that accumulated over months and expressed itself in sudden full body weight. It was the kind where you sat on a couch at 8 o'clock in the morning and your hands stopped wanting to hold anything. She set down the coffee cup. She looked at Nathaniel. She said, "Tell me something that has nothing to do with any of this." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "When I was in Europe, I lived in a city where the best coffee in the world was served in a 20-seat cafe that had been run by the same family for 60 years. No menu. You sat down and the owner brought you what he thought you needed. I went every morning for 2 years, and he never once brought me the same thing twice." She listened. He continued, "I thought about it a lot, what it would be like to know someone well enough to know what they need on any given morning. To have paid enough attention over long enough time to just know." He paused. He said, "I think about it when I am in situations like last night, when knowing what someone needs is the difference between things going one way or the other." Charlotte looked at him. She said, "You knew I needed the footage seen before Roland filed." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew I needed to talk to Victoria myself before any formal action." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew I needed to be the one to call Adrian." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She asked, "How long?" He didn't look away. He said, "College. Since the 2nd year. You were presenting a campaign concept in Professor Aldrich's seminar. You got a question from someone in the back row that was designed to be dismissive, and you took it apart in about 90 seconds without raising your voice and thanked him for it and meant it. That was the moment." He paused. He said, I was going to say something that year, and then you met Adrian. She absorbed this. Outside, Chicago was waking up. The sound of it was reaching even this high. It was the particular urban frequency of a city resuming its own momentum regardless of what had happened inside it overnight. She said, You stayed. He said, I went to Europe when I understood it wasn't going to change. That is the honest version. He looked at his hands. He said, I came back because my father died, and the company needed me. And then I was in a parking structure across from a hospital, and I saw you come out, and I saw what happened after. And I made a decision. She asked, What decision? He said that I was done with patience as a substitute for presence. The room was very still. Charlotte was still sitting with that when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was an unknown number, but the first 3 digits of the number were a prefix she recognized. It was syndicate adjacent. It was a routing number Adrienne's organization used for communications that weren't meant to be traced. She answered. A male voice said her name. The voice was flat. It had the specific flatness of professional menace. The man said, You made a call last night that has created a significant inconvenience for several parties. Her blood went cold. The voice continued, Cass Merrill has been addressed. That has been handled internally. But the Blackwood woman is a problem that remains unresolved. She has material that cannot be allowed to reach publication regardless of the Tribune's current position. The organization's interest is in permanent resolution. Charlotte said, I don't work for your organization. The man replied, No, but you are currently located at 441 North Halsted, 4th floor, with Nathaniel Blackwood and 2 of his security personnel. There was a pause. He said, We have known your location since approximately 2 a.m. We have been waiting to see how the morning developed before making contact. Another pause, deliberately measured. He said, We have a mutual interest in the Blackwood woman being contained. We believe you have the access to accomplish that. We would like you to bring her to a location of our choosing by 9 p.m. tonight. Charlotte looked at Nathaniel. He had read her face and was already moving toward Roland's workspace. She said, And if I don't? The man said, Then the situation becomes significantly more complicated for everyone in that building. The voice paused one final time. He said, 9 p.m., Miss Whitmore. We will be in touch with the location. Do not involve police. You know what happens when police get involved in syndicate matters, and so does Mr. Blackwood. The line clicked dead. Charlotte set the phone on the couch beside her. The morning light was still coming through the warehouse windows, clean and gray and indifferent. She looked at Nathaniel. He had Roland on the phone. He was already moving. His face had the specific quality of a man who has been preparing for a version of this moment for a long time and has arrived at it with all the dread and none of the surprise. Charlotte said, They know where we are. Nathaniel said, I heard. She said, They want Victoria delivered to them by 9 tonight. He said, I heard that too. She stood up from the couch. Her hands weren't shaking. That surprised her. After everything, the sleepless night, the calls, the board on the wall, and the geometry of a situation that had expanded well past anything she had planned for, her hands were completely still. She asked, What do we do? Nathaniel ended his call with Roland. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he had not been willing to say out loud since 2 in the morning. He said, We do the thing neither of us wants to do. We call Victoria. We tell her the truth about who she has been working with and what they are capable of, and what is coming for her if she doesn't move in the next 6 hours. He picked up his phone. He said, And then we use whatever she does next to end this. All of it, tonight. Charlotte was already pulling on her coat. She said, Make the call. Roland appeared in the doorway. His face was the face of a man who had just confirmed something he had been hoping not to confirm. He said, We have a problem. Victoria left the North Shore property this morning at 6 a.m. Her phone is off. Her car's GPS has been disabled. He looked between them. He said, She is gone. The word sat in the warehouse air for exactly 1 second before everyone in the room started moving. Roland was already back on his phone 2 steps into the hallway. His voice dropped into the clipped cadence of a man issuing instructions to people who didn't need them explained. Charlotte pulled her coat fully on, picked up her phone, and ran a fast inventory of what she knew. Victoria had left the North Shore at 6 a.m. 4 hours ago. Her phone was dark. Her car's GPS had been manually disabled, which was not something a panicked woman did by accident. That was preparation. Victoria had known last night that something had shifted, and she had moved before dawn with a plan already in place. The question was where. Nathaniel was at Roland's board, studying the timeline with his hands flat on the table. Charlotte crossed the room and stood beside him. She looked at it with the same focused attention and tried to think the way Victoria thought, not reactively. Victoria was not reactive. Everything she had done over the past months had been planned and sequenced and timed. Even now, even with the footage exposed, and the Tribune story pulled, and the syndicate's interest suddenly and lethally redirected toward her, she would not be running. Running was for people who had run out of plays. Victoria still believed she had a play. Charlotte said, "The journalist." Nathaniel looked at her. Charlotte said, "Dana Reyes." The Tribune story was pulled pending editorial review, not killed permanently. If Victoria goes directly to Reyes with the financial documentation in person, bypasses the editorial hesitation, and puts the physical documents in her hands, the story runs regardless of the source's legal exposure. She looked at Nathaniel. She said, "Victoria doesn't care about the corporate espionage charge anymore. She is past caring about that. She cares about burning everything down before the syndicate reaches her. If she can get that story published in the next few hours, the federal exposure triggers. Adrian's organization goes into crisis containment, and in all that chaos, she becomes a secondary concern." Nathaniel held her eyes. He said, "She is going to Reyes right now this morning." He turned to the hallway. He called for Roland. Roland appeared in the doorway. Nathaniel said, "Dana Reyes, Tribune business desk. Find her current location now." Roland was gone again. Charlotte stood at the board and looked at Victoria's photograph. It was a professional headshot from a Blackwood Holdings function. The composed and deliberate attractiveness. It was the particular quality of a woman who had spent her whole life performing competence so thoroughly. She had eventually stopped being able to distinguish it from the real thing. She understood Victoria in a way she wished she didn't. Not the specific pathology of it, the fixation, the campaign, the willingness to use people as instruments, but the underneath of it. The specific grief of wanting to belong to something that was never going to claim you. Charlotte had spent a decade belonging to a man who had been running a separate version of his life the entire time. Victoria had spent years belonging to a family structure that had never fully converted her from guest to member. Different wounds, different expressions, same original damage. She did not forgive her for any of it, but she understood the root of it. And understanding the root meant she knew exactly how cornered Victoria was going to feel when they found her. Roland came back in 4 minutes. He said, "Reyes lives in Wicker Park. She is home on weekends." Victoria's car was picked up on a traffic camera on Milwaukee Avenue 12 minutes ago. She is heading there. Nathaniel was already at the door. Charlotte followed without being asked. Marcus had the car at the building entrance in under 2 minutes. They moved through Saturday morning Chicago with the particular urgency of people who could not afford to announce their urgency. No sirens, no recklessness, just the aggressive efficiency of a driver who knew the city's arterial logic and used it. Charlotte sat in the back seat and kept her breathing even and her hands still in her lap. She felt the specific pressure of a situation that had narrowed to a single point. They arrived on Dana Reyes block 11 minutes after leaving River North. Victoria's disabled GPS car was parked 2 doors down from a brownstone walk-up. Nathaniel said, "She is already inside." Charlotte looked at the building. 3rd floor, light on, visible through the front window. She said, "I am going up, Nathaniel," said Charlotte. She replied, "If you send Roland, it is a confrontation. If you go, it is a confrontation. If I go alone, it is a conversation." She looked at him steadily. She said, "I can end this without it becoming something worse, but I need to do it alone." His jaw was set. He said, "You have 3 minutes. After 3 minutes, I am coming up." She was out of the car before he finished the sentence. The building's front door was unlocked. It was an old walk-up with a buzzed entry that someone had propped open with a folded takeout menu. She took the stairs to the 3rd floor 2 at a time. not running, but moving with the focused pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going and had decided that pace was its own kind of authority. Apartment 3C, she knocked. 30 seconds passed. The door opened 4 inches on a chain. Dana Reyes was in her late 30s, sharp-faced, with the alert weariness of a journalist, who had learned that unannounced visitors on weekends were either very good stories or very bad ones. She looked through the gap and asked, "Who are you?" Charlotte said, "My name is Charlotte Whitmore. I am the person Victoria Blackwood has been trying to destroy for the past 3 months. I need 2 minutes." There was a pause. The door closed. The chain came off. The door opened. Dana Reyes was still in weekend clothes, jeans, and a worn university sweatshirt. She had the look of a woman whose Saturday morning had already become something she hadn't planned for. Charlotte entered. The apartment was small and lived in, covered in the particular organized chaos of someone whose work existed in every room. There were papers on the coffee table and 2 laptops open on the kitchen counter. Victoria Blackwood was standing at the far end of the small living room in her coat, a manila envelope in one hand. She was looking at Charlotte with the expression of a woman who had just watched her last play intercepted at the line. The 3 of them occupied the room in a triangle of competing interests. Dana Reyes looked between them with the professional assessment of someone who understood she was inside a story that was considerably larger than the one she had been pitched. Charlotte said, "Miss Reyes," without looking away from Victoria. She continued, "Whatever is in that envelope was obtained through a criminal breach of a corporate network. The person who gave it to Victoria obtained it as part of a coordinated campaign to manipulate both a divorce proceeding and a corporate espionage framing. Publishing it exposes your paper to significant legal liability, regardless of the information's accuracy." She paused. She said, "I am not asking you to kill a story. I am asking you to give me 24 hours to provide documentation that will make this story substantially larger and substantially more defensible than what you currently have." Dana Reyes looked at Victoria. Victoria's jaw was tight. She said, "Don't listen to her. She is." Charlotte cut her off. Her voice was flat and final, not raised, not cruel. It was the tone of a woman who has reached the end of her available patience with great precision. She said, "The syndicate contact you were working with has been addressed internally. You know what that means. You know what kind of organization you were dealing with, and what internally addressed means in their language." She held Victoria's eyes. She said, "The people you were using to build this are not going to protect you. They are going to minimize their exposure, and you are a loose end. The only thing standing between you and that outcome right now is the fact that Nathaniel is 2 floors below this apartment. And Roland Graves has been on the phone with 2 attorneys since 6 this morning, who are prepared to file a formal cooperation agreement on your behalf with the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. If you walk out of here with me right now." The room was extremely quiet. Victoria stared at her. She asked why. It came out smaller than she intended. The composure was still there on the surface, but underneath it something had given way, and they both knew it. She asked, "Why would you do that?" "Why would he do that?" Charlotte looked at her steadily. She said, "Because he is not interested in your destruction. He never was. That was always your version of what he wanted, not his." She paused. She added, "And because if the syndicate decides you are a liability before you are inside a cooperation agreement, the problem stops being legal." Victoria's hand with the envelope lowered by half an inch. It was not agreement. It was not surrender. It was the specific micro-movement of a person whose certainty has just developed a fracture line. Dana Reyes made the decision for all of them. She said to Charlotte, "I will need that documentation. The larger story, in 24 hours. She looked at Victoria. She said, "I will hold what I have." She took the manila envelope from Victoria's unresisting hand. Victoria looked at Charlotte. Something moved through her expression. Not remorse. Not yet. Possibly not ever. But a more primitive and more honest thing. The look of a person who has been running very fast for a very long time and has just run out of ground. Charlotte said, "Let us go." They walked out together. On the sidewalk, Nathaniel was standing beside Marcus with his hands in his coat pockets. He had the particular quality of stillness That meant he had been holding himself in place through an act of will for the past 3 minutes. When he saw them come through the door, both of them together, no sirens, no wreckage, something in his face changed in a way he didn't try to control. He looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at him. She said, "I will deal with the attorneys." Her voice was very flat. She said, "I don't want to talk right now." He said, "Okay." She got into Roland's car without another word. Charlotte stood on the sidewalk and breathed the cold February air. She felt the specific exhaustion of a fight that was over. Not cleanly, not cheaply, but over. Done. The thing that had been building for months, from a hospital parking lot in November, through a kitchen at midnight, through a recovery room and a gas station lot, and a Gold Coast lobby and a North Shore dinner table in a warehouse in River North, had reached its final point of pressure and had not detonated. Nathaniel came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a moment. Charlotte said, "She is going to be okay. If she cooperates, she will be okay." He said, "I know." She told him, "You need to talk to her when she is ready." She looked at him and said, "Not to fix it, just to be clear. The way you should have been clear 2 years ago." He said, "I know that too." He paused. He asked, "Are you all right?" She thought about the question honestly. All right was a complicated word for the state she was in. She was standing. She was functional. She had not broken or folded at any point during the preceding 12 hours, despite substantial invitation to do both. Whether that constituted all right in any meaningful sense, she couldn't be certain. She said, "I will be." He nodded. They stood there on the sidewalk for another moment, two people who had been through a great deal in a short time. And then Marcus opened the car door, and they got in and went back to rebuild what was left of the day. The weeks that followed moved differently, not easily. Nothing about any of it was easy. But with a different quality of motion, forward motion, the kind that carried actual weight because it was headed somewhere real instead of somewhere imagined. Victoria entered a formal cooperation agreement with federal financial crimes investigators on the second day. Roland's attorneys managed the process with the efficiency of people who had done it before. The corporate espionage charges were reduced in exchange for full cooperation regarding the syndicate's financial routing documentation. Victoria was not exonerated. She was not destroyed. She existed in the complicated territory between those two outcomes, which was, Charlotte thought, probably where she had always been headed. Eleanor Blackwood called Charlotte 3 days after the Wicker Park morning. Charlotte answered because she had always found that unanswered things accumulated interest. Eleanor said, "I misjudged you." It came out with the particular directness of a woman for whom honesty was easier than apology. She said, "When Nathaniel first mentioned your name, I made assumptions based on incomplete information. I would like to correct that." Charlotte said, "You don't need to." Eleanor replied, "I do need to. I was wrong, and I would like to say so, and I would like to meet you properly, without a dinner party's worth of subtext." She paused. She said, "If you are willing." Charlotte thought about it. She said, "Coffee." "Not dinner, not yet." Eleanor agreed. Coffee. They met the following Thursday at a cafe in the Gold Coast that Eleanor had apparently been going to for 30 years. She was sharp and direct. She had the particular quality of a woman who had survived a great deal and wore it without display. And Charlotte found herself across a small table with 2 Americanos between them, understanding precisely where Nathaniel had learned to pay attention. Eleanor looked at her for a long moment near the end of the hour. She said, "He waited a very long time." Charlotte held her eyes. She said, "I know." Eleanor said, "Don't make him wait much longer." It was not a demand. It was a statement of observed fact. Charlotte drove home with that sitting in her chest. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday afternoon in March. Margaret Tsai called her with the news at 4:15. Charlotte was at her desk in the middle of a campaign presentation review. She excused herself, went to the small conference room at the end of the hall, sat at the empty table, and listened to Margaret tell her it was done. All of it. The asset structure, the prenuptial validation, the counter-narrative withdrawn, the proceedings closed. She thanked Margaret. She sat in the empty conference room for about 5 minutes. She thought about a night 6 years ago when she had married Adrian Marrow in a Chicago venue with 200 guests, and believed it was the beginning of a life she had earned. She thought about everything she had believed that was wrong, and everything she had not believed that was true, and the specific education that came from the gap between those two things. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel grief in its old form. She felt the clean, somewhat exhausting feeling of a weight that had been present so long she had forgotten it was there, finally being set down. She went back to her desk and finished the presentation review. She called Nathaniel at 7 that evening. She said, "It is done." There was a pause. He asked, "How do you feel?" she said. "Tired, clear." She thought about it. She added like someone opened a window. He said, "Good." His voice was careful in the way it was careful when he was managing something he didn't want to mishandle. He asked, "Can I take you to dinner?" She said, "Yes, you can take me to dinner." It was not a milestone or a ceremony. It was dinner at a small Italian place in the West Loop that he had been going to for 2 years. Family run, no reservation needed. It was the kind of restaurant that existed because someone had decided their food was worth making correctly every single night without requiring an audience to validate that decision. They ate pasta and drank wine and talked about things that had nothing to do with Victoria or the syndicate or legal proceedings. And Charlotte found herself somewhere around the second glass of wine doing something she hadn't done in so long that the muscles for it felt unfamiliar. She laughed. Not the social kind, the real kind. It was from something he said that was genuinely funny in a dry and specific way. And she heard the sound of it and recognized it as hers and was surprised. Nathaniel looked at her with the expression of a man who had been hoping to hear exactly that. He did not say anything. He picked up his wine. They walked after dinner through the West Loop in the cold March air. No destination. The city around them doing what cities do, indifferent and alive, and full of the particular beauty of a place that has no interest in your personal history. Charlotte had always loved Chicago at night. She had stayed through everything, partly because she was not willing to let the city go. It had witnessed her worst year, and she intended to make it witness the rest of her life as evidence that the worst year was not the whole story. She had told Nathaniel as much once in the warehouse in the middle of everything, and he had understood it immediately without requiring explanation. That was a thing she was still getting used to, the absence of translation. Spending 10 years explaining yourself to someone who had never quite been listening, and then suddenly being around a person for whom the explanation was unnecessary, was a profound and slightly disorienting adjustment. They stopped at a corner. She turned to look at him. She said, "I am going to need time. Not infinite time, but real time to be certain I am not just reaching for something because everything else broke." He looked at her steadily. He said, "I know." She said, "I am telling you because you deserve the honest version. I have always preferred it." He paused. He said, "Charlotte, I have been waiting since I was 22 years old, and I have gotten considerably better at it. I am not asking you for anything tonight. I am telling you that I am here, and I am not going anywhere, and that is a fact, not a negotiating position." He looked at her with the directness that was simply his baseline mode of existing. He said, "That is all." She held his eyes for a long moment, then she leaned up and kissed him, brief, deliberate. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't need to be anything other than what it is. She pulled back. He looked at her. He said, "Okay." She smiled. It felt like the most natural thing she had done in a year. Adrienne Marrow left Chicago in April. She heard about it from Diane, who heard it from someone in their old social circle, who mentioned it the way people mention things they expect to land harder than they do. He had sold the Gold Coast townhouse and transferred his remaining Chicago operations to a deputy and relocated somewhere south, someone said. No one was certain where, and Charlotte did not spend energy trying to find out. He did not contact her. She had not expected him to. But 2 weeks before she heard about his departure, a package arrived at her office. No return address. Inside was a single document, notarized, formal, signed by Adrian and witnessed by his attorney. A full written acknowledgement that the events at Vanessa Hart's residence in November had occurred as Charlotte had described them to her legal team. No admission of specific criminal liability, but something more than what a man like Adrienne Morrow was generally willing to put on paper. He had also included a handwritten note, 4 sentences. She read it twice and then put it in the desk drawer and closed it. She would decide later whether to keep it. What the note said, she kept to herself. It was the one thing in this entire year that belonged only to her. Vanessa Hart had her baby in January. A girl, as it turned out, not a boy, as everyone had assumed. The paternity question resolved itself through a DNA process initiated by the baby's actual father. It was a man with no connection to the Morrow Syndicate, who had apparently been in Vanessa's life before and during the period of the affair, and who, unlike Adrian, had no empire to protect and no reason to dispute what the test confirmed. Charlotte heard about this through Margaret Sy, mentioned in a footnote of a legal correspondence related to the finalized divorce. She did not feel what she expected to feel. She felt something quieter, not vindication. She had moved past the territory where other people's failures would have felt like her victories. Something more like the distant, slightly melancholy recognition that the people who had burned her world down had mostly managed to burn their own in the process without her assistance, and that there was no satisfaction in that. There was only the fact of it. She sent nothing to Vanessa. There was nothing to send. The communications contract with Blackwood Holdings launched in May. It was by any measurable standard the most significant account her division had ever managed, and she ran it with the focused precision of someone who understood that her professional credibility was the thing she had protected through everything, and she intended to keep protecting it. The work was good. The team she built around it was excellent. Nathaniel was a difficult client in the best sense. Demanding, specific, unwilling to accept work that wasn't exactly what was needed, which made the work better and made her better at it. They kept the professional and the personal in separate registers. Not always perfectly, but with intention. Charlotte moved out of Diana's apartment and into a place of her own, a top-floor 2-bedroom in Lincoln Square. All windows and original hardwood, close enough to her office that she could walk on good days. She spent 2 weeks furnishing it in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's taste but hers. She bought exactly the kind of things she had always wanted, and had silently negotiated away over 10 years of living in a space that was nominally shared, but had never truly been equal. She put nothing on the walls for a month. Then one Sunday she went to a gallery in Pilsen on her own, and bought a large abstract canvas in deep blues and greens that she could not explain and did not try to, and hung it in the living room, where she could see it from the kitchen. And the apartment felt after that, like somewhere she lived. Diane came for dinner that week and looked at the canvas and said, "That is very you." Charlotte said, "I know." Diane said, "I didn't know you had taste." Charlotte replied, "I always had taste. I just spent a decade applying it to someone else's life." Diane opened the wine. They ate dinner and talked until midnight. And at the end of the night, after Diane had gone and the apartment was quiet, Charlotte stood at her kitchen window and looked out at Lincoln Square below. The Saturday night foot traffic, the restaurant lights, the particular aliveness of a neighborhood going about the business of existing. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not happiness exactly, but was the precondition for it. The solid, quiet sense of being in the right place, of having arrived somewhere she had built herself through loss and damage, and considerable unasked for education, and being able to stand in it without apology. She thought about the hospital in November. The ultrasound photo on the kitchen counter, the thing she had lost before she had fully understood she was allowed to have it. She let herself think about it completely, which was something she had not done in a while. She had been managing it, containing it, filing it in the appropriate interior drawer, and closing it when the work required her attention. But she let herself think about it now in the quiet of her own apartment, standing at her own window. And she felt the weight of it without flinching away from it, because she had decided some time ago that the things that had been taken from her deserved to be fully acknowledged before they were put to rest. A child, that was what it had been. A small curved shape in gray static with the strongest heartbeat the technician had ever heard. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and held it there for a moment. Then she took her hand back. She washed the dinner dishes. She went to bed. In the morning, she woke up before 6 and made coffee and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and started working. And the day began the way days began now, with intention, with clarity, with the specific velocity of a person who had stopped waiting for the life she planned and started building the one she actually had. 2 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in July, she and Nathaniel were walking through Millennium Park. No destination, no occasion. The easy, unhurried pace of two people who had stopped needing their time together to justify itself. He had brought coffee from a place 3 blocks over, and they walked with the cups and the summer air, and the city in full July expression around them. The lake was visible to the east, the skyline behind them, the afternoon open. He took her hand at some point. She let him. They walked like that for a while. At a certain point, he said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. It was the particular quality of quiet that meant he was being precise about language. He said, "I am not in a hurry. I have told you that, and I mean it. But I want you to know that what I want when you are ready, when it is right, is everything. Not proximity, not arrangement. Everything." She walked with that for a few steps. The lake was very blue in the July light. Someone's kid was running along the path ahead of them, arms out, doing the things small children do when they have discovered that forward motion is available to them and have not yet found a reason to stop. She said, "I know." He said, "That is not a yes." She looked at him and said, "No, but it is also not a no. And coming from me right now, you should understand that is significant." He looked at her. Something in his face opened in a way she had only seen a few times, the unguarded version. The one that had nothing to do with competence or control or the weight of a life spent in boardrooms and difficult rooms. Just the plain face of a person who has wanted something for a very long time and has received a piece of news he will spend a long time sitting with. He said, "Okay." She agreed, "Okay." They kept walking. The coffee was good. The city was alive and indifferent, and full of people moving through their own private architectures of loss and recovery, and the slow, difficult work of becoming who they intended to be. Charlotte walked through the middle of it with her hand in someone else's hand and the summer light on her face. She had the specific, unshowy, hard-won quality of a woman who had survived everything she had survived and had decided against all available evidence and at considerable personal cost to believe again anyway, not in people, not in promises, in herself. In the next morning, in the fact that the day she was walking through was real and hers and still going. That was enough for now. It was more than enough.